Sometimes a man reaches an age where he's got more regrets than road ahead. That's where Eli Boone found himself in the winter of 1887, 58 years old, worn thin by cattle drives and broken promises, riding toward a cabin his estranged uncle left him. The townfolk called his uncle a lunatic and laughed as Eli passed, saying the cabin was cursed, fit only for wolves. But Eli saw in it a chance to disappear quietly or maybe start over. When a blizzard rolled in, his horse Calico pawed at something beneath the snow, a frozen leather satchel with gold coins, a map, and a letter in a woman's hand. What secrets had his uncle buried in that frozen ground? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ride into Bitter Creek took Eli Boone 3 weeks from the railhead at Cheyenne, and every mile of it felt like penance. The Wyoming Territory in late December was unforgiving country. Wind that cut through a man's coat like it wasn't there, snow that fell sideways, and a cold so deep it made your teeth ache. But Eli had known worse. He'd driven cattle through sandstorms in Texas, survived a cholera outbreak on the Chisholm Trail, and once spent 4 days without water in the Mojave. He was still here, still breathing, and that was something. Though some days he wasn't entirely sure it was enough. Bitter Creek sat in a shallow valley where a creek, frozen solid now, cut through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The town wasn't much to speak of. Maybe 40 buildings scattered along a single rutted street, half of them empty or falling down. A general store with faded paint. A saloon that looked ready to collapse under the next heavy snow. A sheriff's office with bars on the windows, and a church with a steeple that listed to one side like a drunk trying to find his way home. The railroad had passed the town by 5 years back, and you could see it in the faces of the people who'd stayed, hard-worn, resigned, waiting for something that probably wasn't coming. Eli rode Calico down the main street at a walk, his breath steaming in the frigid air. The paint horse moved carefully, hooves crunching through the packed snow, ears swiveling at every sound. Calico was 12 years old now, getting grey around the muzzle, but still had more sense than most people Eli had known. They'd been together since Calico was a 2-year-old colt, and in all that time the horse had never let him down. Couldn't say that about many living things. A few townspeople watched from doorways and windows as Eli passed. He could read their expressions easy enough, curiosity mixed with something colder. Suspicion, maybe, or pity. He caught fragments of conversation drifting on the wind. That's him. Silas Boone's nephew. Poor bastard. Doesn't know what he's getting into. That cabin ain't fit for hogs. Silas was crazy as a bedbug. Apple don't fall far. Eli kept his eyes forward, his face neutral. He'd learned a long time ago that you couldn't change what people thought, and trying only wore you down. Let them talk. He'd be gone soon enough anyway, one way or another. The letter had found him 3 weeks ago in a flophouse in Denver. Eli had been working odd jobs, mucking stables, loading freight, trying to piece together enough money for a warm room and regular meals. The envelope was official-looking, sent by a lawyer named Thaddeus Morton out of Bitter Creek. Inside, the message was brief. His uncle Silas Boone had passed away in October, and the property, such as it was, now belonged to Eli as the only surviving relative. Eli had stared at that letter for a long time. He hadn't seen Uncle Silas since he was maybe 10 years old, back in Kansas before the war. Silas had been his mother's younger brother, a gentleman who'd taught Eli his letters and numbers, who'd shown him how to gentle a horse instead of breaking it. Then one day Silas just left, heading west with a wagon full of dreams, and nobody heard from him again. Eli's mother passed when he was 15, his father 2 years after that, and by then Eli was already drifting, following the cattle, following the work, following nothing in particular. Now at 58, worn down by decades of hard living and harder winters, Eli found himself riding toward a dead man's cabin with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, and the vague hope that maybe, just maybe, he could stop running long enough to catch his breath. He found the general store easily enough. A hand-painted sign read, "Keen's Mercantile," in weathered letters. Eli tied Calico to the hitching post and climbed the steps, his joints protesting in the cold. Inside, the store was warmer, heated by a pot-bellied stove in the corner. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the essentials: flour, coffee, canned goods, rope, nails, lamp oil. The smell of wood smoke and dried herbs filled the air. A woman stood behind the counter, maybe 50 years old, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that looked like they'd seen their share of trouble. She studied Eli for a moment, then nodded. "You'd be Silas Boone's nephew," she said. "Not a question. Eli Boone, ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat. "Word travels fast. In a town this size, everything travels fast." She gestured toward the stove. "Warm yourself. You look half frozen." Eli moved closer to the heat, feeling it seep into his bones. "I'm looking for directions to my uncle's property." The lawyer's letter gave a general location, but about 4 miles northeast of town. "Follow the creek road till you hit the split rail fence. What's left of it, anyway. Turn east, follow the tree line. Can't miss it, though you might wish you could." Her voice softened slightly. "I'm Martha Keene. I knew your uncle, Mr. Boone. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, ma'am." Eli hesitated, then asked, "What can you tell me about him?" "I haven't seen Silas since I was a boy." Martha moved around the counter, her expression thoughtful. "Silas kept to himself mostly. Came into town maybe once a month for supplies, always paid in cash, never caused trouble. Some folks—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some folks said he wasn't quite right in the head. Called him strange, a hermit. But I never saw anything wrong with him. He was quiet is all. Sad, maybe. Like he was carrying something heavy that he couldn't set down." That description settled on Eli like a familiar coat. He understood that kind of weight. "The letter said he died in October, found frozen in his cabin. Doc Holloway said it looked like his heart just gave out." "Peaceful, at least." Martha returned to the counter. "You planning to stay or just settle the estate and move on?" "Haven't decided yet." Eli pulled out a short list he'd written. "Need some supplies either way. Coffee, beans, salt pork, lamp oil, matches." As Martha gathered the items, Eli heard the door open behind him. He turned to see a man in a sheepskin coat with a silver star pinned to his chest. The sheriff was maybe 45, tall and thick through the shoulders, with a face that had settled into permanent lines of authority and suspicion. "Sheriff Drummond," Martha said, her voice carefully neutral. The sheriff nodded to her, then fixed his attention on Eli. "You'd be the nephew. Heard you rode in." "Eli Boone. James Drummond. Sheriff of Bitter Creek." He didn't offer his hand. "Come a long way for a worthless piece of property." "It's what I've got," Eli said simply. "Your uncle wasn't well liked in this town. Caused problems, made accusations. Lived like an animal out in those woods." Drummond's eyes were flat, assessing. "I hope you're not planning to follow in his footsteps." Eli held the sheriff's gaze, keeping his voice level. "I'm just here to see what he left behind. Don't plan on causing any problems." "See that you don't." Drummond turned to leave, then paused at the door. "That cabin's 4 miles from nowhere. Storm comes in, you could be snowed in for weeks. Might want to think about whether it's worth the trouble." After the sheriff left, the store felt colder despite the stove. Martha wrapped Eli's supplies in brown paper, her hands moving efficiently. "Don't mind James. He's been sheriff for 15 years, and his father held the job before him. Drummonds have run this town for a long time. They don't much care for questions or strangers. Seemed like he was warning me off." "Probably was." Martha handed him the packages. "But you're a grown man. You'll do what you need to do." She paused, then added quietly, "Your uncle deserved better than what this town gave him. If you want to know who he really was, don't listen to the gossip. Judge for yourself." Eli paid for his supplies and loaded them onto Calico's pack saddle. As he prepared to leave town, he noticed an older man sitting on a bench outside the saloon, bundled in a threadbare coat. The man raised a hand in greeting and Eli walked over. "Dr. Holloway," the man introduced himself. His face was ruddy, veined from too much whiskey, but his eyes were sharp. "I treated your uncle a few times over the years, and I was the one who found him. Appreciate you taking care of him. Wasn't much I could do by the time I got there. But I wanted you to know Silas wasn't crazy. He was a smart man, educated. Spoke Latin, could quote Shakespeare. We played chess most Thursday evenings." Doc Holloway looked out at the empty street. "Whatever happened to him, whatever broke him, it wasn't his mind. It was his heart." Eli nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me that. One more thing." The doctor's voice dropped lower. Silas used to say something, especially when he'd had a bit to drink. He'd say, "I should have fought harder. I should have made them see." Never would say what he meant by it. "But I got the feeling your uncle carried a powerful regret." Those words stayed with Eli as he rode out of Bitter Creek, following Martha's directions. The afternoon sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, throwing long shadows across the snow. Calico moved steadily through the cold, breath pluming, hooves finding purchase on the icy ground. When Eli finally saw the cabin, his first thought was that the townspeople had been generous in their descriptions. The structure was barely standing, a single-room log building with a sagging roof, one window with most of the glass missing, and a door that hung crooked on its hinges. Snow had drifted against the walls, nearly covering the lower logs. A small lean-to barn behind the cabin looked equally decrepit. Eli dismounted and stood for a long moment just looking. This was what Silas's life had come to. Whatever dreams had brought him west, whatever hopes he'd carried, they'd ended here in this forgotten place. Alone and cold, he led Calico to the lean-to first, clearing enough snow to get the horse inside and out of the wind. There was old hay in the corner, musty but usable. Eli rubbed Calico down, made sure he had water from the creek, then carried his gear to the cabin. Inside was worse than outside. The single room was maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with a stone fireplace that was full of old ash, a crude bunk against one wall, a rough-hewn table, and a single chair. Everything was covered in dust and mouse droppings. The floor was dirt, frozen hard. In one corner stood a small shelf with a handful of books, and beside the bunk was a wooden crate that served as a nightstand. Eli set his pack down and began the work of making the place barely livable. He cleared the fireplace, gathered what kindling he could find, and got a fire started with the last of his matches. As the flames caught and warmth began to spread, he felt the exhaustion of 3 weeks on the road settling into his bones. He was too tired to do more tonight. He spread his bedroll on the bunk, ate some jerky and hard biscuits, and sat staring into the fire. Somewhere in this cabin, in this life, was the story of what happened to Uncle Silas, what had broken him, what regret he'd carried to his grave. Before sleeping, Eli examined the few books on the shelf. They were old, but well cared for. A volume of Shakespeare's plays, a collection of Emerson essays, a farmer's almanac from 1869, and wrapped in oilcloth, a Bible. Eli pulled out the Bible, opened it carefully. Inside the front cover, in careful script, was written, "Property of Silas Boone. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." As Eli leafed through the pages, pressed flowers fell out, delicate blooms that had been carefully preserved. In the margins throughout, Silas had written notes in a cramped hand. Eli read a few. Patience is not passive waiting, but active endurance. Forgiveness does not change the past, but it does enlarge the future. A man who has lost everything can still choose how he remembers. These were not the words of a madman. They were the reflections of someone who'd suffered deeply and searched for meaning in that suffering. Eli closed the Bible gently, placed it back on the shelf. Tomorrow he would start learning the truth about his uncle. Tonight he would simply rest in this cold cabin and listen to the wind howling through the pines, carrying with it the whispers of the past. 3 days passed in hard labor. Eli worked from first light until his hands were too numb to hold tools, making the cabin barely habitable. He patched the roof with pine boughs and canvas from his bedroll, replaced the broken window panes with oiled paper, rehung the door so it would actually close, and spent hours hauling firewood. Each night he fell onto the bunk exhausted, muscles aching, hands raw despite his gloves, but the work felt good. It gave him purpose, kept his mind from wandering down old paths of regret. And slowly the cabin became something more than a hovel. Not comfortable, but survivable. A place a man could last out the winter if he had to. On the morning of the 4th day, Eli woke to an ominous stillness, the kind of quiet that comes before a serious storm. He'd learned to read weather over decades on the trail, and this felt like a bad one coming. He went outside to check on Calico and found the horse already restless, stamping in the lean-to, ears pinned back. "I know, boy," Eli said, running a hand down the paint's neck. "Storm's moving in. We'll be all right. Got enough wood stacked, enough food. We'll wait it out." By midday, the first flakes began to fall. Within an hour, it was a full blizzard, wind shrieking through the trees, snow coming down so thick Eli couldn't see 10 feet past the cabin. He brought extra hay to Calico, made sure the lean-to was as secure as he could make it, then retreated inside. The storm raged for 2 days. Eli kept the fire going, rationed his food, and read from Uncle Silas's books by lamplight. He found himself drawn back to the Bible, studying those margin notes, trying to understand the man who'd written them. The flowers pressed between the pages were wildflowers, columbine, Indian paintbrush, lupine. Someone had gathered them carefully, preserved them with intention. Why would a hermit, a madman as the town called him, take such care with flowers? On the third morning, Eli woke to silence. The storm had passed in the night. When he opened the cabin door, the world was transformed, buried under at least 3 feet of fresh snow, pristine and blinding white in the morning sun. The pines drooped under the weight, and the air was so cold, it burned going into his lungs. He needed to check on Calico. Eli waded through the deep snow, each step an effort. The lean-to had held, thank God, and Calico was still there, though clearly agitated. The horse whinnied when he saw Eli, then did something strange. Instead of coming forward for his usual morning greeting, Calico moved to the back corner of the lean-to and began pawing at the ground with his hoof, snorting. "What is it, boy?" Eli moved closer, following the horse's gaze. Calico pawed again, more insistently, at a spot where the snow had drifted against the back wall. His behavior was deliberate, focused. Eli had learned to trust the horse's instincts. They'd saved his life more than once. He grabbed the shovel he'd been using to clear snow and began digging where Calico indicated. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something solid, but not frozen ground. Something with give to it. Eli dropped to his knees, brushing snow away with his gloved hands. The corner of something brown appeared. Leather, he realized. Old leather buried beneath the snow and dirt. His heart began to beat faster. He dug more carefully now, working around the edges of whatever this was. It took 20 minutes of careful excavation, but finally he freed it. A leather satchel about the size of a small carpet bag, wrapped in what looked like oiled canvas. The whole package was frozen solid, ice crystals glittering on its surface. Eli carried it into the cabin, his hands shaking slightly. Not from cold this time, from anticipation. From the sense that something important, maybe the answer to questions he hadn't even known to ask, sat frozen in his hands. He set the satchel near the fire, not too close, just enough to start the slow process of thawing. It would take time. Rushing it could damage whatever was inside. So Eli forced himself to be patient. He made coffee, ate a breakfast of bacon and day-old biscuits, tended the fire, all while watching the satchel from the corner of his eye. By late afternoon, the ice had melted. Water pooled around the package on the hearth. Eli tested the leather, still stiff, but pliable enough. He unwrapped the oiled canvas carefully. Beneath it, the satchel was old but well-made, with brass buckles that had tarnished green. The leather itself was quality work, the kind that lasted. With hands that weren't quite steady, Eli unbuckled the straps and opened the satchel. Inside, preserved by the oiled canvas and the freezing temperatures, were 3 items. The first was a leather pouch. Eli opened it and gold coins spilled into his palm, 20 of them, eagles mostly, each worth $10. $200. More money than Eli had seen in one place in years. Enough to buy a small spread, stock it with cattle, or live comfortably for a year or more. The second item was a map. Eli unfolded it carefully, his fingers gentle with the old paper. It was hand-drawn but expertly done, showing a route from Bitter Creek northeast into the mountains. Landmarks were marked with small, careful symbols. A distinctive rock formation here, a forked tree there, a creek junction. At the end of the trail, maybe 30 miles into the high country, was a location marked with a star and labeled in neat script, Promise Valley. The third item was a letter, written on fine paper that had yellowed with age but remained intact. The handwriting was elegant, clearly feminine. Eli carried it to the table, lit the lamp for better light, and began to read. "My dearest Silas," it began. "If you are reading this, then our plans have changed in ways I cannot yet imagine. I'm writing this on the 1st day of July, 1869. The day you filed our land claim, the day we truly became partners in this dream." Eli's breath caught. 1869, 18 years ago. The letter continued. "Promise Valley is everything we hoped, a hidden paradise where we can build our life together, away from judgment and hatred. The gold we found will give us the means to start fresh. Not as much as the 49ers dreamed of, perhaps, but enough. Enough to build a home, start a family, live in peace." Eli read faster, drawn into the words. "I know the risks we're taking. Your filing the land claim will draw attention. My father says we should wait, be more cautious, but Silas, I am tired of waiting. I'm tired of hiding what we feel. You asked if I was certain, if I understood what it would mean to choose you over everything I've known. My answer is yes, 1,000 times yes." The letter went on, speaking of dreams and plans, of a cabin to be built, of fruit trees to plant, of children they hoped for. It was written with such hope, such certainty in their future, that Eli felt his throat tighten. Near the end, the tone shifted slightly. "Keep this satchel safe, my love. If anything should happen to delay our plans, if we must separate for a time, this is our proof. The coins, the map, this letter, they are evidence of our commitment. Promise Valley belongs to us, whatever papers the county clerk may or may not approve. In our hearts, in God's eyes, we are already bound." The letter was signed. "Yours forever, Rebecca Chen, July 1st, 1869. Eli sat back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. Rebecca Chen, a Chinese woman, if the name told true. And Silas, his uncle Silas, had been in love with her, had filed a land claim with her, had found gold with her, had planned a life with her. In 1869, in Wyoming territory, such a relationship would have been more than scandalous. It would have been dangerous, illegal in many places. The kind of thing that could get a man or a woman killed. Eli looked again at the map, at the careful markings, at Promise Valley with its star. Then he looked at the gold coins, at the letter dated 18 years past. His mind raced, putting pieces together. Whatever had happened in 1869, it had gone terribly wrong. Silas never built that cabin in Promise Valley, never married Rebecca Chen, never had those children they'd dreamed of. Instead, he'd ended up here, alone in this pitiful cabin, called mad by the townspeople, dead at 60-something with nothing to show for his life, but pressed flowers and margin notes about forgiveness. And Rebecca, what had happened to Rebecca? Eli stood, paced the small cabin. The story was taking shape in his mind, but it was incomplete, full of gaps and questions. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what had destroyed his uncle's dreams, and why this satchel had been buried behind the cabin, hidden away as if waiting for someone to find it. Outside, Calico whinnied. Eli went to the door, looked out at the horse, standing in the cleared area near the lean-to. The paint was watching him as if asking, "Well, what now?" "Good question, boy," Eli said softly. "Good question." He returned inside, carefully repacked the coins, folded the map, and placed the letter back in the satchel. These weren't his to spend or throw away. They were pieces of a story, maybe the most important story of his uncle's life. And somewhere in that story was an answer to what broke Silas Boone. An answer to what regret he carried to his grave. Eli had ridden to Bitter Creek, expecting nothing but a cold cabin and maybe a winter of quiet before moving on. But now, holding this satchel, looking at a map to a place called Promise Valley, reading words written by a woman named Rebecca Chen, who'd loved his uncle, now everything was different. Now Eli had a reason to stay, a reason to dig deeper. A reason to find out what the town of Bitter Creek might have done to two people who dared to love each other, despite the world telling them no. He wasn't just settling an estate anymore. He was beginning a search for truth. And given the way Sheriff Drummond had warned him off, given the way folks went quiet when Silas's name came up, Eli had a feeling that truth was going to make some people uncomfortable. Good. Let them be uncomfortable. He'd spent his whole life running from things. Maybe it was time to run towards something instead. That evening, Eli examined the satchel's contents again by lamplight, taking his time, looking for details he might have missed. The gold coins were straightforward enough, proof of the wealth Rebecca and Silas had spoken of. The map was clear, professionally drawn, meant to be followed. But the letter raised more questions than it answered. As he lifted the letter for another reading, something small slipped from between the folds of paper and clinked against the table. Eli picked it up, held it close to the lamp, a pendant. Small, maybe an inch and a half long, carved from jade so dark it was almost black. The stone was cool to the touch, polished smooth, hanging from a delicate silver chain. On one side was carved a symbol, Chinese characters, Eli guessed, though he couldn't read them. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of thing that spoke of value, both monetary and sentimental. This had been Rebecca's, he was certain. A piece of her heritage, perhaps a family heirloom. And Silas had kept it, hidden away with the map and the letter, for 18 years. Eli held the pendant up to the light, watching it turn slowly on its chain. The jade caught the lamplight, revealing subtle variations in the stone's darkness, threads of deep green running through the black. Beautiful work, the kind of thing a woman would treasure, would keep close, the kind of thing she might give to the man she loved. He set the pendant on the table beside the letter and sat back, thinking. Tomorrow he would ride back into Bitter Creek. He needed to know more about Rebecca Chen, about what had happened in 1869, and he needed to do it carefully. Sheriff Drummond had already made it clear he didn't want the past disturbed, which in Eli's experience meant the past held secrets worth disturbing. The morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Eli dressed in layers, saddled Calico, and tucked the jade pendant into his vest pocket. He left the gold and the map hidden in the cabin. No sense carrying temptation, but the pendant felt important. It was proof that Rebecca Chen had been real, had loved Silas, had existed as more than a name in a letter. The ride to town took an hour. Calico's breath steamed in the frigid air, and ice crystals formed on Eli's beard. But the sky stayed clear, the sun bright on the endless white landscape. Bitter Creek looked half dead in the morning light. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but the street was empty except for a single wagon parked outside the general store. Eli tied Calico at the hitching post and went inside, grateful for the warmth. Martha Keene was behind the counter, sorting through a shipment of dry goods. She looked up as Eli entered, and something in her expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of purpose. "Mr. Boone, didn't expect to see you back so soon. Figured the storm might have kept you out at the cabin for a while? Had some questions," Eli said, moving to the stove to warm his hands. "Wondered if you might help me with them." Martha set down the bolt of cloth she'd been examining. "I'll try." Eli chose his words carefully. "You mentioned knowing my uncle, that he came to town for supplies. Did he ever—" He paused, searching for the right approach. "Did he ever talk about anyone? Family, friends, people he knew before he came here?" Silas kept his past to himself. Martha's tone was measured, careful. "Why do you ask?" "I found some things at the cabin. Personal things. Made me curious about his life before." Eli pulled the pendant from his pocket, let it rest in his palm. This was among his belongings. "It's Chinese work, isn't it?" Martha's eyes widened slightly. She came around the counter, looked at the pendant without touching it. "Yes, jade, good quality. That's worth something." "I'm not asking about its value," Eli said gently. "I'm asking about where it came from. About who might have owned it." The store's door opened, and two women entered, chattering about the weather. Martha stepped back from Eli, her expression closing off. "I should tend to my customers, Mr. Boone." But as she moved away, she said quietly, just loud enough for Eli to hear, "There used to be Chinese families here. Railroad workers mostly, and their kin. This was back in the 60s and early 70s. They didn't stay long." Eli pocketed the pendant and waited while Martha helped the other customers. When they left, arms full of purchases, he approached the counter again. What happened to them? The Chinese families? Martha busied herself with straightening items on the counter. There was trouble. The kind that happens when people are afraid of what's different. The kind that ends with folks leaving in the night. She looked up, met his eyes. One family ran a laundry service. The Chens, good people, hard-working. They had a daughter. She stopped abruptly as the door opened again. This time it was Sheriff Drummond, his face set in hard lines. "Mrs. Keene," he said with a nod, then turned his attention to Eli. "Mr. Boone, seems you're making a habit of coming to town. Just getting supplies, Sheriff. No law against that. None at all." Drummond moved closer, his presence filling the small store. "Though I hear you've been asking questions. About the past. About people who left a long time ago. I'm curious about my uncle's life." "Natural enough. Sometimes the past is better left alone," Drummond said. His tone was conversational, but there was steel underneath. "Especially when that past involves people who aren't around to speak for themselves anymore." Eli held the sheriff's gaze. "My uncle was around until a few months ago. Nobody thought to ask him his story while he lived? Your uncle was a hermit and a drunk. Whatever story he had wasn't worth hearing." Drummond adjusted his gun belt, a casual gesture that managed to be threatening. "You'd be wise to focus on the present, Mr. Boone. Winter's hard out at that cabin. You should be thinking about survival, not ancient history." After the sheriff left, the store felt colder despite the fire. Martha wrapped a few items Eli hadn't asked for, coffee, sugar, dried apples, and pushed them across the counter. "No charge," she said quietly. "Consider it a kindness to Silas's memory. Mrs. Keene. The Chens had a daughter named Rebecca," she said quickly, voice barely above a whisper. "Beautiful girl, educated, spoke perfect English. She disappeared in the summer of 1869. The family said she ran away, but Martha glanced toward the door, making sure they were alone. But some folks thought something worse happened. The family left Bitter Creek a month later. Never came back. Was there an investigation?" "Clayton Drummond was sheriff then." "James's father." Martha's mouth pressed into a thin line. "He said there was nothing to investigate. Said Rebecca Chen went back to California where her people came from. Case closed." Eli felt a cold certainty settling in his chest. "But you don't believe that." "I was 17 years old that summer," Martha said. "Rebecca Chen gave me this the day before she disappeared." She reached under the counter, pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, was a silver locket. She opened it. Inside was a lock of dark hair. "She told me to keep it safe," Martha continued, her voice thick with old emotion. "Said, if anything happened to her, this was proof that she'd loved someone, that her life had meant something. I was too young and scared to understand then. By the time I did, it was too late." Eli took the locket carefully, studying it. The hair inside was brown, not black. Not Rebecca's then. Someone else's, a man she'd loved, Silas's hair. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I've carried it for 18 years, and it's done nothing but sit in a box, gathering guilt." Martha's eyes glistened. "Rebecca Chen deserved better than to be forgotten. If you're asking questions, if you're trying to learn the truth, then maybe you can do what I was too frightened to do. Maybe you can make sure she's remembered right." Eli pocketed the locket alongside the pendant. Two pieces now of a story that was growing clearer and darker with each revelation. Silas and Rebecca hadn't just loved each other. They'd been planning a life together. And someone had stopped them. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet." Martha's voice was urgent. "James Drummond is like his father, proud, powerful, and he doesn't forgive challenges to his authority. If you keep asking questions, if you keep pushing, he'll push back. And out at that cabin, 4 miles from anywhere, you're vulnerable. I'll be careful." Careful might not be enough, but she nodded, accepting his choice. "Doc Holloway knows more than he says. He was here in 69, saw things. He drinks to forget, but he remembers. Talk to him." Eli left the store with more than supplies. He carried 2 pieces of jewelry that had belonged to a young woman who disappeared 18 years ago. He carried confirmation that Rebecca Chen had been real, had been in Bitter Creek, had planned to marry his uncle. And he carried the growing certainty that whatever had happened to her, it hadn't been natural or innocent. As he rode Calico back toward the cabin, Eli turned the facts over in his mind. A Chinese woman and a white man, in love, planning to claim land and marry. This in 1869, when such unions were illegal in many territories, socially unacceptable everywhere. They'd found gold, filed a claim, prepared to build a life, and then Rebecca disappeared. The family fled. and Silas ended up broken and alone in a falling-down cabin. Branded a madman by the town, but madmen didn't carefully preserve letters and pendants. Madmen didn't keep flowers pressed in Bibles with notes about forgiveness. Silas hadn't lost his mind. He'd lost everything else. That evening, Eli sat at the cabin's rough table with Silas's Bible open before him. He'd read through it once already, but now he turned the pages more carefully, looking for anything he might have missed. The pressed flowers, the margin notes. They spoke of a man searching for peace, trying to make sense of suffering. But there had to be more. He reached the back cover, felt something shift beneath his fingers. The inside back cover had a leather pocket. Eli hadn't noticed it before, designed to hold maps or papers. His pulse quickened as he carefully opened it. Inside was a tintype photograph, protected by a piece of oiled cloth. Eli removed it with trembling hands, carried it to the lamp for better light. The image was faded but clear enough. Two people stood together in front of what looked like a simple canvas backdrop. The man was young, maybe 30 years old, clean-shaven, with dark hair and eyes that looked directly at the camera with quiet confidence. Eli recognized the shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders. This was Silas as a young man, before whatever happened had broken him. Beside him stood a woman of exceptional beauty. She was small, delicate-featured, with long dark hair pulled back in a simple style. Her dress was plain but well-made, and she wore a pendant at her throat. Eli couldn't be certain in the grainy image, but it looked like the jade pendant now resting in his vest pocket. But what struck Eli most was her expression. She wasn't staring blankly at the camera, as was common in photographs of that era. She was smiling, a small, genuine smile, and her body was angled slightly towards Silas. As if drawn to him, even in the stillness required for the photograph, Silas's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, protective but not possessive. And he was smiling too, which was rare for the formal photographs of the 1860s. These were two people who couldn't quite contain their happiness, even for the camera. On the back of the tintype, written in careful script, were the words, July 4th, 1869, our Independence Day, the date from Rebecca's letter, the day they'd filed the land claim, the day they'd committed fully to their future together. Eli sat back, the tintype cradled in his palm. Here was proof, undeniable physical proof, that Silas and Rebecca had existed together, had been real, had loved each other. This wasn't gossip or speculation. This was evidence, and it raised urgent questions. If Rebecca had simply run away, as the official story claimed, why would Silas have kept this photograph so carefully preserved? Why would he have saved her pendant, her letter, the map to the land they were supposed to share? No, a man didn't treasure such things unless the woman was dead, unless she'd been taken from him, unless he was mourning. Eli slept poorly that night, haunted by the image of those two young people smiling at the camera, unaware of what was coming. In his dreams, they rode together toward Promise Valley, hope bright in their faces, while shadows gathered behind them. Morning came cold and grey. Eli made his decision over strong coffee and yesterday's bread. He needed official records, land claims, legal documents, anything that would tell him what had happened in the summer of 1869. The courthouse in Bitter Creek would have those records if they still existed. He rode into town under a sky-threatening snow, the tintype wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked inside his coat. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building near the center of town, one of the few structures that looked permanent. Eli tied Calico outside and climbed the steps. Inside, the building was warmer, heated by a large stove in the main hall. A sign pointed toward the county clerk's office on the second floor. Eli climbed the stairs, his boots echoing in the empty building. The clerk's office was a cramped room filled with shelves of leather-bound ledgers and boxes of loose papers. Behind a cluttered desk sat an elderly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up as Eli entered, his expression unwelcoming. "Help you?" "Name's Eli Boone. I'm looking at records from 1869. Land claims, legal filings, that sort of thing." The clerk, a nameplate on his desk, read, A. Brennan, frowned. "That's 20 years back. Most folks don't care about ancient history. I do. I'm settling my uncle's estate." Silas Boone, trying to understand what property he owned, what claims he'd filed. Brennan's expression shifted at the name. Silas Boone. Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while. He studied Eli more carefully. You really his nephew? I am. The old clerk was quiet for a moment, then sighed. Your uncle filed papers here summer of '69. I was just starting this job back then, fresh from Denver. Silas Boone struck me as a decent man. Educated, polite, not like some of the rough characters we got through here. He stood slowly, joints creaking. Let me get those ledgers. Might take a few minutes. While Brennan disappeared into the back room, Eli studied the office. Maps of the territory hung on the walls, their boundaries shifting over the years as new counties were formed, old claims settled or abandoned. Wyoming was still new country, still being carved into shape. Brennan returned carrying 2 large ledgers, their leather covers worn from years of handling. He set them on the desk with a thump. 1869. What specifically are you looking for? Land claims, filed by Silas Boone. Brennan opened the first ledger, ran his finger down columns of entries. Here, June 15th, 1869. Silas Boone files claim on 160 acres in the Northern District. Location listed as Promise Valley. He turned the ledger so Eli could see. There it was, in faded ink. Silas's signature, the legal description of the land, the filing date. Official and binding. Was the claim approved? Eli asked. Brennan flipped forward several pages. Looks like it was contested. Here, August 10th, 1869. Clayton Drummond files a counterclaim, says the land was already occupied by him, that Boone's claim is invalid. On what grounds? Doesn't say specifically. Just notes that Sheriff Drummond, that would be Clayton, he was sheriff then, investigated and ruled in favor of his own claim. Brennan's tone suggested he recognized the conflict of interest. Boone's claim was struck. Drummond took possession. Eli's hands clenched. So the sheriff investigated his own claim and found in his own favor. Wasn't unusual back then. Law was flexible in the territories. Men with power made the rules. Brennan turned more pages. There's more here. July 1869, marriage license application. Silas Boone and... He stopped, eyes widening slightly. Rebecca Chen. Let me see. The entry was brief but clear. Silas Boone, age 32, and Rebecca Chen, age 24, applied for a marriage license on July 2nd, 1869. Across the application, stamped in harsh black ink, was a single word, denied. Beneath that, in smaller print, reason miscegenation. State law prohibits marriage between Caucasian and Mongolian races. Eli stared at the page, rage building slowly in his chest. They'd tried to do everything legally. File for land, apply for marriage, build a legitimate life. And at every turn the law had stopped them. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because the world couldn't accept their love. Is there anything else? He asked, voice tight. Any other filings, complaints, legal actions? Brennan searched through the rest of 1869 and into 1870. Here, September 1869, property dispute. Clayton Drummond versus Silas Boone. Case notes indicate... He read silently, his face growing troubled. Indicates there was violence at the disputed property. Drummond claimed Boone attacked him. Boone failed to appear to defend himself. Court found in Drummond's favor, awarded him full possession of Promise Valley. Silas didn't show up for the hearing. According to this, he was notified but didn't appear. Could be he'd already left the area, or... Brennan trailed off. Or he was too broken to fight anymore, Eli finished. He thought of the photograph of those 2 young people full of hope. What had happened between July and September to destroy them so completely? He knew the answer, even if he didn't have all the details yet. Violence, that's what the record said. Violence at Promise Valley. Mr. Brennan, was there ever an investigation into Rebecca Chen's disappearance? The clerk removed his spectacles, cleaned them slowly. That's not really my area. Please, Brennan sighed. I remember when it happened. Rebecca Chen went missing in August of '69. Her family came here, asked for an investigation. Sheriff Drummond looked into it, or said he did. Reported back that the girl had run off, probably gone to California. The family didn't believe it, but what could they do? They weren't citizens, had no standing. They left town a few weeks later. took their business with them, and no one questioned this. A young woman disappears, her family doesn't believe the sheriff's story, and everyone just accepts it. Mr. Boone, you have to understand the times. Chinese weren't, he struggled for words. They weren't protected the way they should have been. People looked the other way. It wasn't right, but it was how things were. Eli stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Can I get copies of these records? The land claim, the marriage application, the court case? Copies cost money. How much? $1 for each document. Eli pulled $3 silver from his pocket, set them on the desk. I'll wait. While Brennan made careful copies in his cramped handwriting, Eli stood at the window looking out over Bitter Creek. The town seemed peaceful enough from here. Snow-covered roofs, smoke rising from chimneys, people going about their business. But beneath that peaceful surface lay a rot. A crime covered up, lives destroyed. A young woman disappeared, probably murdered. A good man broken beyond repair. And the Drummond family had built their authority on that foundation of theft and violence. When Brennan finished, Eli folded the copies carefully, tucked them inside his coat next to the tintype. He had evidence now. Not enough to convict anyone in a court of law, perhaps, but enough to know the truth. Enough to understand what had happened to his uncle. Mr. Brennan, he said at the door, thank you for your honesty. Your uncle was a good man, the old clerk said quietly. I never believed what folks said about him. Whatever happened out there at Promise Valley, whatever made him the way he was, it wasn't his fault. I always thought that. Did you ever tell anyone? Who would I tell? Who would listen? Brennan's expression was sad, resigned. I'm an old man now, Mr. Boone. I've lived with a lot of regrets. But I can tell you this, if you're planning to do something about this, to make it right somehow, you'll have my testimony. I'll say what I saw, what I know. It won't change the past, but maybe it'll help. Eli nodded his thanks and left the courthouse. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, light flakes drifting down through the gray afternoon. He stood for a moment on the steps, feeling the weight of what he'd learned. Silas and Rebecca had tried to build a life. They'd followed the law, filed the proper papers, done everything right. And they'd been crushed for it. Crushed by racism, by greed, by a powerful man who wanted what they'd found and didn't care what he had to do to take it. Now, 18 years later, that powerful man was dead. But his son wore the sheriff's star and held the same authority. And the truth remained buried, along with Rebecca Chen's body. Wherever it lay, Eli mounted Calico and rode slowly out of town, his mind made up. He would find Promise Valley. He would see the place where Silas and Rebecca's dreams had died, and he would learn exactly what had happened there in August of 1869. The truth couldn't bring them back, but it could give them justice. And maybe, just maybe, it could give Eli something he'd been searching for his whole life, a reason to stop running and start fighting. Back at the cabin, Eli worked through the evening, repairing the floor near the fireplace. Several boards had rotted through, letting cold air seep up from below. He'd bought lumber in town and now pried up the damaged planks, preparing to replace them. As he lifted the third board, something small and metallic fell through the gap and clinked against the hard-packed earth below. Eli reached down, felt around in the dirt, and pulled out what he'd dislodged, a bullet casing. Brass, tarnished with age but still intact. He carried it to the lamplight, turned it in his fingers. .44 caliber, the kind used in a Colt revolver or a Winchester rifle. Common enough, but its location was odd, wedged between floorboards as if it had fallen there and been forgotten or hidden. Eli examined the cabin's interior with new eyes. This room had witnessed something. The bullet casing wasn't from a hunting accident or target practice. It had been fired inside the cabin, close enough to the floor that the casing had bounced and lodged between the boards. He thought of Silas living here alone for years, keeping that satchel buried outside, preserving Rebecca's pendant and letter, pressing flowers in his Bible, a man living with ghosts, with memories of violence. Maybe this casing was another memory, evidence of something that had happened here, or something Silas had brought back from Promise Valley. Eli set the casing on the table beside the other artifacts. The collection was growing: pendant, locket, tintype, letter, map, court documents, and now this bullet casing. Each piece told part of the story. He just had to put them in the right order. The next morning brought Sheriff Drummond to his door. Eli was outside splitting firewood when he heard the horse. He set down the axe, wiped his hands, and watched as Drummond rode up on a big roan gelding. The sheriff dismounted, tied his horse, and approached with that same careful authority he carried everywhere. "Morning, Boone." "Sheriff." Eli didn't move toward him, didn't invite him closer. "Heard you were at the courthouse yesterday, going through old records." "That's right. My uncle's estate, like I said." Drummond's jaw tightened. "Brennan tells me you were asking about land claims from 20 years ago, about people who aren't around anymore. That doesn't sound like estate business to me." "My uncle filed a land claim in 1869, Eli said calmly. "That claim was contested and taken by your father. I wanted to understand what happened. What happened is ancient history. My father was sheriff, he investigated, and the courts ruled in his favor. End of story, except it's not ended, is it?" Eli gestured toward the rundown cabin. "My uncle lived here like a hermit for years, died alone with nothing. Meanwhile, your father took possession of valuable land that rightfully belonged to Silas. That's not ancient history. That's theft." Drummond's face flushed red. "You want to be careful with accusations like that, Boone. My father was a respected lawman who served this county for 30 years. What he did according to the law. According to a law that said a Chinese woman and a white man couldn't marry," Eli shot back. "According to a law that let your father investigate his own property claim and rule in his own favor. That's not justice. That's corruption." The sheriff's hand moved to rest on his gun belt. Not drawing, just a reminder that he was armed, that he had authority. "I don't know what fantasy you've cooked up about your crazy uncle and some Chinese girl, but let me give you some facts. The Chinese in this territory were railroad workers, temporary labor. When the work dried up, they moved on. Rebecca Chen left of her own accord. My father checked into it thoroughly. Then why didn't Silas ever recover? Why did he keep her things, her photograph, until he died?" "Because he was deranged," Drummond said flatly. "Some men can't handle disappointment. They break. Your uncle broke. That's not anyone's fault but his own." Eli stepped closer, close enough that Drummond had to choose whether to hold his ground or back up. The sheriff held his ground, but Eli could see tension in his shoulders. "I don't believe that," Eli said quietly. "And I don't think you believe it either. I think your father did something at Promise Valley in 1869, something he spent the rest of his life covering up, something that left a young woman dead and a good man destroyed. That's slander. It's the truth." They stood there for a long moment, two men locked in silent confrontation. Finally, Drummond stepped back, but his expression had gone cold and dangerous. "This cabin is 4 miles from town," he said. 4 miles from help. Winter storms can last for days. A man alone out here could have an accident. Fire, wolves, fall through the ice. Nobody would know until spring thaw, and by then it wouldn't matter. You understand what I'm saying? Sounds like a threat, Sheriff. It's a warning. This territory is hard on people who don't know when to mind their own business." Drummond moved toward his horse, swung into the saddle. "You got a choice to make, Boone. You can settle your uncle's affairs, sell this property, and move on with your life. Or you can keep stirring up trouble nobody wants stirred up. One of those choices ends well for you. The other doesn't." He rode off without waiting for a response, his horse's hooves kicking up snow. Eli stood in the cold, watching until the sheriff disappeared into the tree line. The threat had been clear enough, and based on what had happened to Rebecca and Silas, Drummond was capable of backing it up. The question was whether Eli cared enough about the truth to put himself at risk. He looked back at the cabin, thought of his uncle living here year after year, broken and alone, carrying guilt and grief that weren't his to carry. Thought of Rebecca Chen, 24 years old, disappeared without a trace while the law looked the other way. Yes, he cared enough. That evening, Eli rode into town and went to Doc Holloway's office. He found the doctor in his examination room, half drunk, but still functional, stitching up a miner's hand by lamplight. "Be with you in a minute," Holloway said without looking up. Eli waited while the doctor finished his work, accepted payment in the form of a small pouch of gold dust, and sent the miner on his way. Then Holloway turned his attention to Eli, his eyes bloodshot but sharp. "You look healthy enough." "So I'm guessing this isn't a medical visit?" It's not. I need to talk to you about 1869, about what really happened at Promise Valley. Holloway was silent for a long moment, then moved to a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured generous amounts in each, slid one toward Eli. Figured someone would come asking eventually. Didn't think it'd be Silas's nephew. He downed half his glass in one swallow. What do you want to know? Everything. I've got pieces. The land claim, the marriage application, the court case. I know Rebecca disappeared. I know your father took the land. But I don't know what actually happened. I was there, Holloway said quietly. Not at the very end, but close enough. I was the only doctor in Bitter Creek back then, still am. And I was young, idealistic, stupid enough to think I could make a difference. He refilled his glass. Silas and Rebecca, they were real. Their love was real. Most beautiful thing I'd seen in this hard country. 2 people who looked at each other like the rest of the world didn't exist. What happened to them? Clayton Drummond happened to them. The bitterness in Holloway's voice was sharp as broken glass. Silas found gold at Promise Valley. Not a lot, but enough to matter. Filed his claim legally, brought Rebecca to see the place, made plans. But Clayton heard about it. Don't know how. Maybe somebody at the land office talked. Maybe someone saw them together and put pieces together. Either way, Clayton wanted that land. Wanted the gold. So he filed a counterclaim, more than that. He orchestrated a confrontation. Holloway drank again, his hand shaking slightly. August of 1869. Clayton gathered some men, his deputy, a couple of toughs from town, and rode out to Promise Valley. Told everyone they were going to remove illegal squatters from disputed land. But that wasn't the real reason. What was the real reason? To drive Silas off and... Holloway stopped, his face twisted with old pain. And to make sure Rebecca couldn't testify against him. Couldn't tell what happened, couldn't claim the land herself. Eli's hands clenched around his glass. He killed her. I don't know for certain. I wasn't there. But Silas came back alone, beaten half to death, raving about how they'd shot at him, how he'd heard Rebecca screaming. He begged me to go back with him to find her, to help her. But Clayton had already spread word around town that Rebecca had run off, that Silas was crazy with drink and jealousy. Nobody would listen. Nobody would go. You didn't go? Holloway's face crumpled. I was 26 years old, just starting my practice. Clayton Drummond controlled this town. If I'd gone against him... He shook his head. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that it was too dangerous, that I had to protect my own life, my own future. So I didn't go. And Silas went back alone, came back 3 days later, and he was gone. The man I'd known was just gone, replaced by a ghost who spent the next 18 years dying slowly. The room was quiet, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Eli absorbed what he'd heard, fitting it into the pattern he'd been building. It confirmed what he'd suspected. Rebecca hadn't run away. She'd been killed at Promise Valley. And Clayton Drummond had gotten away with it because he wore a badge, and Rebecca was Chinese, and nobody with power cared enough to stop him. Why are you telling me this now? Eli asked. Because I'm old and I'm tired and I've lived with this guilt for 18 years. Holloway poured another drink. Because Silas deserved better. Because Rebecca deserved better. And because if you're fool enough to try to make this right, you should at least know what you're up against. James Drummond already warned me off. Then you know he'll protect his father's legacy. The Drummond name is all he's got. If you prove Clayton was a murderer and a thief, James loses everything. His authority, his standing, maybe his freedom if he tries to cover it up. Holloway met Eli's eyes. He'll kill you to prevent that. Just like his father killed Rebecca. Eli stood, set his untouched whiskey on the table. Then I'll have to be careful. Careful might not be enough, maybe not. But I'm done running from things, Doc. I've spent 58 years drifting from place to place, never standing for anything, never mattering. This, what happened to Silas and Rebecca, this matters. If I walk away now, I'm no better than everyone else who looked the other way. He left Holloway in his office. The doctor, staring into his whiskey glass, with the expression of a man who'd looked away once and spent a lifetime regretting it. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. Eli untied Calico, swung into the saddle, and rode back toward the cabin. He was committed now, no turning back. He would find Promise Valley, see the place where it had all gone wrong, and gather whatever evidence remained. Then he would force the truth into the open, whatever the cost. For Silas, for Rebecca, and maybe finally for himself. Eli spent the next 2 days preparing. He cleaned his rifle, organized his supplies, studied the map until he'd committed every landmark to memory. The route to Promise Valley was clear enough. Follow the creek northeast for 10 miles, then strike east through a gap in the ridgeline. Follow a series of natural markers until the valley opened up. In summer, maybe a 2-day ride. In winter, with snow and uncertain weather, it could take 4 or 5 days, maybe longer. He was checking Calico's shoes, making sure they were solid, when he heard a horse approaching. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle, leaning against the barn wall. But he relaxed when he recognized Martha Keene's sturdy mare. Martha dismounted stiffly. She wasn't young, and the cold made everyone's joints ache. She was carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle under one arm. "Mrs. Keene," Eli said, surprised. "It's a long ride out here." "It is. But I needed to see you before you left." She gestured toward the cabin. "Can we talk inside?" They settled at the table, and Martha set her bundle down. "Word's gotten around that you've been asking questions. That you went to the courthouse, talked to Doc Holloway. People are nervous. Sheriff Drummond most of all. He came out here, made his position clear. I figured he would." Martha's expression was troubled. "Eli, I want you to understand something. What happened in 1869, it changed this town. Not for the better. Those of us who knew the truth, who suspected but couldn't prove anything, we've carried that for 18 years. Some of us with more courage than others." She unwrapped her bundle, revealing food supplies, dried meat, hardtack, coffee, sugar. "If you're going up into those mountains, you'll need this. I can't take your supplies." "Yes, you can. Consider it payment for a debt I never settled." She pulled something else from her coat pocket, the silver locket she'd shown him before, the one Rebecca had given her. "And I want you to have this. Maybe you'll find a place for it. Somewhere meaningful." Eli took the locket carefully, opened it to look again at the lock of Silas's hair inside. "You're sure?" "I've kept it hidden for 18 years. That's long enough." Martha's voice wavered slightly. "Rebecca gave it to me the day before she disappeared. We were standing outside the laundry her family ran. It's gone now, burned down years ago. She pressed this into my hand and said, 'If anything happens, remember that I lived. Remember that I loved and was loved.' I was 17, Eli, 17 and scared of everything. I didn't understand what she was trying to tell me until it was too late. What was she afraid of? Clayton Drummond. He'd been coming around, asking questions about the land claim, about her relationship with Silas, making threats disguised as warnings. Rebecca knew something bad was coming. She was trying to prepare, to leave evidence behind, but she was trapped. Loving Silas meant staying in Bitter Creek, but staying meant facing Clayton's wrath. Martha stood, moved to the window, looked out at the snow-covered landscape. The night she disappeared, there were gunshots from up in the mountains. Several of us heard them. Next morning, Clayton rode back into town with his men, said they'd driven off claim jumpers. 3 days later, Rebecca's father came to him asking about his daughter. Clayton said she'd run away to California, but Rebecca's father didn't believe it. He searched for weeks, but there was nothing to find. Eventually the family left, broken by grief and fear. Did anyone else ever go to Promise Valley, try to find evidence? Clayton made it clear the valley was his property, that trespassers would be prosecuted. Then he sold the land a few years later to a mining company, made a good profit. By then, Silas was already living out here, already broken. The town just moved on, like it never happened. Martha turned back to face Eli. "But it did happen. And you're the first person in 18 years who's cared enough to look for the truth. I'm Silas's nephew. It's my responsibility. It's more than that, though, isn't it?" Martha's eyes were shrewd. "You see yourself in him, a man alone, carrying regrets, trying to figure out if his life meant anything." Eli couldn't deny it. "Maybe, then find the truth. But be careful. James Drummond is dangerous, and he's got the law on his side. If you threaten him, and you are threatening him, he'll respond with violence. Out there in the mountains, anything could happen. Nobody would question it if you had an accident." After Martha left, Eli packed carefully. The supplies she'd brought, his own provisions, ammunition, rope, blankets, medical supplies. The map and documents went into a waterproof pouch he could wear under his coat. The pendant, the locket, the tintype. He wrapped these carefully and packed them separately. Evidence, but also sacred objects. Proof that two people had loved each other, despite the world telling them no. He wrote a letter to Martha and left it on the table, sealed in an envelope with her name on it. Inside, he'd written simply, "Gone to Promise Valley. If I don't return, you'll know why. Give this letter and the documents in my saddlebags to a federal marshal. Make sure the truth comes out. Thank you for your courage. Eli Boone." At dawn, he saddled Calico and led the horse outside. The morning was clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that made breathing painful. But the weather was holding, and that's what mattered. He couldn't afford to wait for perfect conditions. Drummond was getting more anxious, more aggressive. It was only a matter of time before the sheriff made a move that couldn't be ignored. Eli swung into the saddle, settled his weight, and looked back at the cabin one last time. Silas had lived here for nearly 2 decades, nursing his grief, unable to let go of the past, but equally unable to do anything about it. Eli understood that paralysis. He'd lived with it himself for years. But now, holding the reins, looking toward the mountains where Promise Valley waited, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. He touched his heels to Calico's sides, and they moved out, following the frozen creek northeast. The sun was just breaking over the eastern peaks, throwing long shadows across the snow. Behind him, smoke rose from a few chimneys in Bitter Creek, people waking up, starting their days, going about their business, and aware that one man was riding toward a reckoning 18 years overdue. The first day's travel was relatively easy. The creek provided a natural path, and the ground was mostly level. Calico moved steadily, his breath steaming, hooves crunching through the packed snow. They passed through stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, occasionally startling deer or elk that bounded away through the trees. By midday, Eli had covered maybe 8 miles. He stopped to rest Calico, to eat some jerky and hardtack, to check the map. According to the markings, he should reach the ridgeline gap by tomorrow afternoon. After that, the terrain would get rougher, climbing into higher elevations, navigating rocky passages, following a route that had been designed to be hidden rather than convenient. As he prepared to move on, Calico's ears suddenly pricked forward, swiveling toward the back trail. The horse snorted softly, nervous. Eli went still, listening. At first, he heard nothing but wind in the pines, then faint but distinct hoofbeats. Someone was following him. He considered his options quickly. He could wait, confront whoever was coming, or he could push on, try to lose them in the rougher terrain ahead. The second option seemed wiser. If it was Drummond or his men, a confrontation out here in the open wouldn't end well for Eli. He mounted quickly, urged Calico into a faster pace. The paint responded, picking up speed despite the snow. They moved off the creek trail, angling toward the tree line, where tracks would be harder to follow. Behind him, the hoofbeats grew louder, definitely following, definitely closing the distance. Eli found a thick stand of spruce and guided Calico into it, dismounting quickly. He pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard, found a position where he could see the back trail without being easily spotted. Calico stood quietly beside him, trained by years on the trail to stay calm in tense situations. The rider came into view a few minutes later, a single horse and rider moving at a steady pace, clearly tracking Eli's trail. As they drew closer, Eli got a better look and felt surprise wash over him. It wasn't Drummond or one of his deputies. It was a young man, maybe 30 years old, dressed in working clothes, riding a serviceable bay gelding. The man sat his horse nervously, looking around as if unsure of himself. Eli stepped out of the trees, rifle lowered but ready. "That's far enough." The young man pulled up sharply, hands raised to show they were empty. "Mr. Boone, please, I'm not here to cause trouble." "Then why are you following me?" "My name's Owen Keller. I'm a deputy in Bitter Creek." He gestured to his chest, where a badge glinted beneath his coat. "I need to talk to you." "Your boss already talked to me. Made his position pretty clear. I'm not here on the sheriff's orders." Keller's voice was urgent. In fact, he'd fire me or worse if he knew I was here. But I heard you were headed to Promise Valley, and He stopped, struggled for words. I need to know the truth. About what happened in 1869. About what Sheriff Drummond's father did. Eli studied the young man carefully. Keller looked genuinely distressed, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. Not from cold, from nerves. Why would you care about something that happened before you were born? Because I've been a deputy for 2 years, and in that time I've started to see things that don't add up. Files that are missing. Old cases that got closed too quickly. Sheriff Drummond gets angry whenever anyone mentions his father, acts like the man was a saint. But I've heard whispers. And when I heard you were asking questions about 1869, about a Chinese woman who disappeared, Keller's voice dropped. My mother was Chinese. She married my father against everyone's advice, and they made it work. But she told me stories about what it was like back then, about the violence, the hatred. So when I heard about Rebecca Chen, I wondered if maybe there was something that got covered up. Something that should have been investigated but wasn't. Eli lowered his rifle completely. This was unexpected, but it might also be useful. A deputy who questioned Drummond, who wanted the truth, that could change everything. If you're not here on Drummond's orders, how did you find me? I've been watching the cabin. Saw you leave at dawn. I took a chance, followed your trail. Keller dismounted, approached carefully. Mr. Boone, if there's evidence at Promise Valley, evidence of a crime, I can help you bring it back. I can make sure it gets to the right people. A federal marshal, maybe. Someone outside of Drummond's control. And you'd be willing to testify against your own sheriff? If he's protecting a murderer's legacy. Yes, Keller's jaw set with determination. I became a deputy because I believed in law and order. In justice. Not in covering up crimes because they're old or because the criminal wore a badge. Eli made his decision. All right, you can ride with me. But understand this. We're going into dangerous country in the dead of winter. And if Drummond finds out you're helping me, your life is forfeit. I understand. And if you're playing me, if this is some kind of trap, I'll know. And I won't be forgiving. It's not a trap. I swear it. They mounted and rode together toward the ridgeline, 2 men seeking truth in a landscape of lies. Behind them, Bitter Creek faded into the distance. Ahead, Promise Valley waited with its secrets. 3 days into the mountain journey, Eli and Owen Keller had fallen into an easy rhythm. The young deputy proved competent in the wilderness. He could build a fire efficiently, knew how to conserve supplies, and kept watch without complaint. More importantly, he seemed genuine in his desire for truth, asking thoughtful questions about what Eli had discovered, offering insights into how Drummond operated. The weather had held so far, though clouds were building to the northwest, another storm coming, just a matter of when. They needed to reach Promise Valley soon, find whatever evidence existed, and get back before being trapped by snow. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they reached a location marked on the map with a small cross symbol. The terrain had grown rougher, the elevation higher. They were deep in the high country now, surrounded by granite peaks and dense pine forests. The cross marked a spot near a rock formation, 3 large boulders leaning against each other like old men in conversation. What's significant about this place? Owen asked, studying the map over Eli's shoulder. Don't know, but Silas marked it specifically. Worth investigating. They dismounted, leading their horses carefully through the snow. Behind the 3 boulders, partially hidden by a rockfall that might have happened in the 18 years since the map was drawn, was the mouth of a shallow cave. Eli felt his pulse quicken. This was deliberate, a hiding place, a refuge. He pulled out his lantern, lit it carefully, and entered the cave with Owen close behind. The cave extended back maybe 20 feet, with a ceiling just high enough to stand. The floor was relatively flat, layered with old pine needles and dirt. Near the back wall, protected from the weather, were the remains of a fire ring, stones arranged in a circle, charcoal still visible, despite nearly 2 decades of abandonment. Someone lived here, Owen said quietly. At least for a while. Eli moved the lantern slowly, illuminating every corner. In one alcove, he found what he was looking for, a collection of items wrapped in oilcloth, tucked into a natural shelf in the rock. He pulled it out carefully, unwrapped it. Inside were preserved supplies, matches still sealed in a tin, a small cooking pot, a folded blanket, and most importantly, a leather-bound journal. Eli's hands trembled as he opened it. On the first page, in delicate handwriting, was written, "The Journal of Rebecca Chen, July 1869. "Dear God," Owen whispered. "It's hers." They sat by the cold fire ring, and Eli began to read aloud by lantern light. Rebecca's words transported them back 18 years, to a summer of hope that had turned to nightmare. The early entries were full of joy. Rebecca wrote of meeting Silas, of their growing love despite the social barriers between them. She described Promise Valley in loving detail, a hidden paradise where a creek ran clear, where wildflowers bloomed in profusion, where they'd found a gold vein that would give them the means to start over somewhere more tolerant. July 4th, 1869, Eli read. "Today we had our photograph taken," Silas insisted, though we had to travel all the way to Cheyenne to find a photographer who would serve us. He said he wanted proof that we existed, that our love was real. I wore the jade pendant my grandmother gave me. I've never been happier. The entries from July continued in this vein, preparations for building a cabin, plans for their future, the painful rejection of their marriage license, but determination to proceed anyway. Rebecca wrote of her father's concern, of the warning looks from townspeople, of Sheriff Drummond's increasingly frequent visits to her family's laundry. Then August arrived, and the tone shifted. August 10th, 1869. "Something is wrong." Silas rode into town this morning, and Clayton Drummond stopped him in the street. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he said Promise Valley was his land, that Silas was squatting illegally. When Silas showed him the filed claim, Drummond laughed and said the claim was worthless, that a man who consorted with Chinese couldn't hold property in Wyoming. I'm frightened. I've seen that look in men's eyes before, the look that says they'll do violence and feel justified in doing it. August 15th, Silas wants us to leave immediately, to abandon Promise Valley and head to California. But my family can't just pick up and go. They have a business, debts, obligations, and I won't leave them. So we've decided to stay, to fight for what's ours. Perhaps that's foolish. Perhaps we should run. But I'm tired of running from hatred. August 18th. This will be my last entry before we go to Promise Valley to begin building. Silas has gathered supplies, and we plan to establish our claim through presence, living on the land, improving it. If we're there, working the claim, surely the law will protect us. Surely even Drummond won't. The entry stopped mid-sentence. The next page was blank. Then several pages later the writing resumed. But the handwriting was different, shakier, desperate. August 20th. I'm alive. I shouldn't be, but I'm alive. Eli's voice faltered. He had to stop, take a breath before continuing. We rode to Promise Valley yesterday morning, Silas and I, full of hope despite everything. We began marking out where the cabin would stand. We were happy. For a few hours we were perfectly happy. Then they came. Clayton Drummond and 4 men, all armed. They said we were trespassing, that we had to leave immediately. Silas tried to reason with them, showed them the claim papers. Drummond tore them up, said they were worthless. Then he looked at me with such hatred, such cold certainty, and said, "She comes with us. She's evidence of a crime, miscegenation, consorting with whites. She'll be dealt with according to law." Silas knew what that meant. There would be no trial, no law. Only violence in the woods where no one would see. Owen had gone pale, reading over Eli's shoulder. Eli continued, his voice rough. Silas fought them. He fought like a man possessed, trying to protect me. They beat him down with rifle butts, and when he still wouldn't stop, Drummond shot at him. The bullet grazed Silas's head, knocked him unconscious. I thought he was dead. I screamed, tried to reach him. That's when Drummond turned his gun on me. He fired, and I felt the impact in my side, burning pain. I fell, heard him tell his men, "Leave them both. The wolves can have what's left." Then they rode away. Eli had to stop reading. The horror of it. Rebecca shot, Silas beaten and shot, both left for dead in the wilderness, made his stomach turn. Owen was openly crying now, tears running down his face. "Keep reading," Owen said. "Please. We need to know." Eli swallowed hard, continued. I lay there for I don't know how long. When I finally tried to move, I realized the bullet had gone through my side without hitting anything vital. Painful, bleeding, but not fatal. Silas was unconscious but breathing. I tried to wake him, to move him, but I was too weak. I heard voices, Drummond's men returning. They'd forgotten something, or come back to make sure we were dead. I had seconds to decide. I dragged myself into the trees, hid in a hollow beneath a fallen log. Watched as they checked Silas, who was starting to stir. Drummond's deputy said, "This one's alive." Drummond responded, "Then tell him his Chinese whore is dead. Tell him we disposed of the body. He breaks the story, he's next." They put Silas on a horse, took him away. Left me bleeding in the forest. The next entries described Rebecca's agonizing journey to this cave, a location she and Silas had marked as a safe fallback point. She'd crawled most of the way, stopped the bleeding with moss and strips torn from her dress, survived on creek water and whatever she could forage. The entries became briefer, written days apart as she fought off infection, slowly healed. September 1st. I'm stronger now. The wound is healing, though I'll always carry the scar. I walked to a ridge yesterday where I could see Bitter Creek in the distance. Watched for any sign of Silas. Nothing. I learned from a prospector passing through, I hid and listened to him talk to himself, that Silas is alive but broken. That he's told no one what happened, stays drunk most days, lives like an animal. Drummond warned him, I'm sure. Threatened to finish the job if he talks. My poor Silas, he thinks I'm dead, thinks he failed to protect me. And I can't tell him otherwise, without putting his life in more danger. October 15th, the first snow fell today. I can't stay here through winter. I'll freeze or starve. I've made my decision. I'll head west to California, try to find my mother's family. I've written to my father, left the letter with a Chinese merchant in a mining camp 2 days from here. Told him I'm alive, that I'm leaving, that he mustn't tell anyone, especially not Silas, because Drummond will kill us both if he learns I survived. My father will understand. He'll grieve me as dead, and that grief will keep the secret safe. November 8th, this is my final entry. Tomorrow, I begin the long walk to California. I'm leaving this journal here in this cave. If Silas ever comes looking, and I pray someday he does, he'll find it. He'll know I lived. He'll know I forgave him for not being able to save me. Tell him to live, whoever finds this. Tell him our love was real and beautiful and worth everything. Tell him to stop mourning and start living. And tell him that in whatever life comes after this one, I'll be waiting. Forever yours, Rebecca Chen. November 8, 1869. The journal ended there. Eli sat in stunned silence, the book heavy in his hands. Rebecca had survived. She lived through the attack, made it to this cave, eventually walked away to start a new life. And Silas had never known. He'd spent 18 years believing she was dead, believing he'd failed her, carrying guilt that should never have been his. All these years, Owen said, voice breaking. He thought she was dead. He destroyed himself with grief and guilt, and she was alive. Drummond let him believe it, Eli said, anger building in his chest like a fire. That was the real cruelty. Not just the attack, not just the theft of the land, but making Silas live with the belief that he'd let her die. Owen stood, paced the small cave. This changes everything. Rebecca Chen didn't die at Promise Valley. She survived, she wrote this account. This is evidence of attempted murder, of corruption, of a sheriff using his power to commit violence and cover it up. It's evidence of more than that, Eli said quietly. It's proof that Silas Boone wasn't crazy, wasn't broken by weakness or drink. He was broken by evil, by a man who should have protected him but chose to destroy him instead. He carefully wrapped the journal in oilcloth again. And now we have her words, her testimony. After all these years, Rebecca Chen gets to speak. They sat together in the cave as the afternoon light faded, both processing what they'd discovered. This journal changed the narrative completely. Rebecca hadn't died that day in August. She'd fought, survived, tried to move forward. The tragedy wasn't that she died young, but that she'd been forced to abandon the man she loved, to let him believe she was dead, to build a new life from the wreckage of her dreams, and Silas had never known. had never been given the chance to heal, to understand that she'd forgiven him, that she wanted him to live. "We need to find out what happened to her," Owen said finally. "If she made it to California, if she lived a good life, if she—" He stopped. "If she's still alive," Eli finished. "She'd be, 42 years old now? It's possible. We need to know. And we need to make sure Drummond faces justice for what his father did." Eli nodded, securing the journal with his other evidence. Tomorrow they would reach Promise Valley, see the place where it had all happened. Then they would return to Bitter Creek and force the truth into the light. Rebecca Chen would not be forgotten. Her story would be told. And James Drummond would answer for his father's crimes, whether he liked it or not. They reached Promise Valley the next afternoon, under a sky heavy with storm clouds. The final approach took them through a narrow gap between two granite ridges, then down a steep slope that opened suddenly into the valley itself. Even in winter, even buried under snow, Eli could see why Silas and Rebecca had chosen this place. It was a natural basin, maybe a quarter-mile across, sheltered on three sides by pine-covered slopes. A creek ran through the center, frozen now but clearly substantial in warmer months. The valley floor was relatively flat, perfect for building. In summer this would be paradise: wildflowers, clear water, abundant game, and gold somewhere beneath the ground. "It's beautiful," Owen said quietly. And Eli heard the reverence in his voice. They rode slowly into the valley, both men scanning the landscape for any sign of what had happened here 18 years ago. Near the creek, Eli spotted something, a depression in the snow too regular to be natural. He dismounted, walked over, began brushing snow away. Beneath the white powder were the remains of a foundation. Logs cut and notched, arranged in a rectangle maybe 12 feet by 15 feet. The beginning of a cabin that had never been finished. The wood was weathered grey, partially rotted, but still visible. Silas and Rebecca had started building their dream here before Drummond destroyed it. "This is where they would have lived," Eli said, running his hand over the old logs. He could almost see them, two young people working together, laughing, planning their future. The image was so vivid, it hurt. Owen was searching the area systematically, moving in widening circles. "Eli, over here." Near the tree line, Owen had found something half buried in the snow and pine needles. Eli joined him, looked down at what appeared to be an old tin box, rusted and battered. Owen pried it open carefully. Inside was a collection of small items, a few hand tools, some nails, a folded piece of paper. Eli unfolded the paper gently. It was brittle with age, but still readable. An assay report, dated June 1869, confirming the presence of gold in samples taken from Promise Valley. Not a massive strike, but significant. Enough to build a comfortable life. "This is what Drummond wanted," Owen said. "Not just the land, but what was under it." They kept searching, and within an hour had found more evidence of Silas and Rebecca's brief time here. A fire pit lined with stones, a cache of supplies buried in a hollow tree, flour gone to powder, coffee beans still intact, matches that would never light again. And near the foundation, something that made Eli's throat tighten. 2 wooden stakes driven into the ground, about 6 feet apart, with a third stake halfway between them. "Markers for where something was meant to stand. What are these?" Owen asked. Eli knew. Trees. They were going to plant fruit trees, plan a future that extended beyond themselves. He touched the nearest stake, weathered almost to nothing. They wanted children to play in the shade of these trees someday. The storm that had been threatening finally arrived as afternoon faded toward evening. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier. They needed shelter, and quickly. Owen spotted what looked like an overhang near the base of the southern ridge. They rode toward it, found a shallow space beneath a jutting rock face. Not quite a cave, but enough to provide protection from the worst of the storm. They set up camp efficiently, gathering what dry wood they could find before the snow soaked everything. Got a fire going, tended to the horses, set out their bedrolls. As the storm intensified outside their shelter, they sat by the fire, eating dried meat and hardtack, both lost in their own thoughts. "We have evidence now," Owen said finally. Rebecca's journal, the assay report, the foundation showing they were building here legally. Doc Holloway's testimony about what Silas told him. The court records showing the claim was stolen. That's enough to bring charges against a dead man, Eli pointed out. Clayton Drummond is beyond justice now, but his son isn't. James Drummond has been covering this up, threatening you, obstructing your investigation. That's crimes we can prove. And once this story comes out, once people understand what his father did, the Drummond legacy is finished. Eli poked at the fire, watched sparks spiral upward. Finishing the Drummond legacy isn't enough. Rebecca deserves more than revenge against the family that hurt her. What do you mean? I mean, we need to find her. Or if she's gone, find her family. Make sure they know what happened. Make sure they know she survived, that she was strong enough to rebuild her life. Eli pulled out the jade pendant, held it up to catch the firelight. This belonged to her grandmother. Rebecca kept it through everything. Someone in her family should have it back. Owen nodded slowly. There are Chinese benevolent societies in San Francisco, organizations that help immigrant families. If Rebecca made it to California, they might have records. We could search. We will search. Eli's voice was firm. But first we deal with Drummond. We take this evidence back to Bitter Creek, and we make sure everyone knows the truth. No more silence. No more looking away. They sat quietly for a while, the fire crackling, snow hissing as it hit the hot rocks around their shelter. Eli found himself thinking about his own life, the decades he'd spent drifting, running from commitment and purpose. He'd told himself he was free, unencumbered, but really he'd been lost, afraid to care about anything deeply enough that losing it would hurt. Silas had cared deeply, had loved deeply, and it had destroyed him when that love was taken away. But even in his destruction, even broken and alone, he'd kept Rebecca's memory alive, had pressed flowers in a Bible, had written notes about patience and forgiveness, had hidden away evidence that someone might someday find. That took a different kind of courage than Eli had ever shown. I've been thinking about my uncle, Eli said into the quiet, about the choices he made after losing Rebecca. Part of me wishes he'd fought harder, demanded justice, refused to let Drummond win. But another part of me understands. He was beaten, threatened, and he believed the woman he loved was dead. What was there to fight for? For her memory, Owen said. For the truth. Truth doesn't bring back the dead, doesn't heal grief. Eli turned the pendant in his fingers. But maybe if he'd known she survived, if he'd known she wanted him to live, to be happy, maybe he could have done that. Could have honored her by building a new life instead of mourning the old one. You think he would have wanted you to find this? Owen gestured to the evidence they'd gathered, to expose what happened. I think he was hoping someone would. That's why he kept everything, why he left clues. He couldn't do it himself. Drummond had broken him too thoroughly. But he could leave breadcrumbs for whoever came after. For whoever cared enough to look. The storm raged through the night. Eli and Owen took turns keeping watch, feeding the fire, making sure the horses stayed calm. In the early hours of morning, when Owen was sleeping and Eli sat alone with his thoughts, he pulled out the tintype photograph again, studied those two young faces, so full of hope and certainty. They deserved better. They deserved to build their cabin, plant their trees, raise their children in this beautiful valley. They deserved to grow old together, to sit on a porch in the evening sun and remember the day they'd had their photograph taken, the day they'd claimed their independence. Instead, they'd gotten violence and loss, and 18 years of separate suffering, but Rebecca had survived. That was important. She hadn't died young and forgotten. She'd fought, healed, walked away to build a new life. She'd been strong enough to leave the past behind, to honor her love for Silas by living fully rather than dying with their dream. That took more courage than Eli had given her credit for. More courage than most people ever showed. He carefully wrapped the tintype again, placed it with the other evidence. Tomorrow, if the storm cleared, they would ride back to Bitter Creek. They would carry Rebecca's story with them, written in her own hand, preserved against time and weather and the determination of powerful men to bury the truth. And they would make sure that everyone, Martha Keene, Doc Holloway, the townspeople who'd looked away, and especially James Drummond, understood what had been done in their name, in their silence, 18 years ago. Dawn came grey and cold, but the storm had passed. Eli and Owen broke camp quickly, loaded their horses, and prepared for the journey back. Before leaving, Eli walked one more time to the old foundation, stood looking at the valley. "I'm sorry you didn't get to live here," he said quietly, not entirely sure whether he was speaking to Silas or Rebecca or both. "But I promise your story won't be forgotten. I promise I'll make this right." A breeze moved through the pines, carrying with it the faint scent of distant flowers, impossible in winter. Probably just his imagination, but it felt like an answer nonetheless, like permission to go forward, to do what needed doing. They rode out of Promise Valley as the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the snow. Behind them, the valley lay peaceful and beautiful, holding its secrets close. Ahead, Bitter Creek waited with all its complications and dangers. The return journey was faster than the trip out. They knew the route now, could push the horses harder without fear of getting lost. And both men felt the urgency pressing on them. The longer they were gone, the more time Drummond had to prepare, to plan whatever response he was preparing. They made good time the first day, camping that night in a sheltered spot near the creek. The second day, they pushed even harder, riding from dawn until dark. By the third day, they were exhausted but determined. Knowing Bitter Creek was less than 10 miles ahead, that's when they saw the rider. He was waiting at a bend in the trail, sitting his horse calmly, as if he'd been there for hours. As Eli and Owen approached, they recognized him, one of Drummond's deputies, an older man named Wade, who'd always seemed uncomfortable with the sheriff's harsher methods. Eli's hand moved to his rifle, but Wade held up both hands, showing he was unarmed. "I'm not here to stop you," Wade called out. "I'm here to warn you." They approached cautiously, stopping about 20 feet away. "Warn us about what?" Eli asked. "Drummond knows you went to Promise Valley, knows the deputy here rode with you." Wade glanced at Owen with something like sadness. "He's planning to arrest you both when you get back to town. Says you're trespassing on private property, interfering with a peace officer, maybe even claim you threatened him." "That's a lie," Owen said hotly. "I know it is. But Drummond's got 3 other deputies who'll back his story, and he's got the law on his side. You ride into Bitter Creek, you'll be arrested. And once you're in his jail—" Wade didn't finish the sentence. "He didn't need to. What are you suggesting?" Eli asked. "Go around Bitter Creek. There's a federal marshal in Cheyenne, man named Foster. He's honest, doesn't owe Drummond anything. Take your evidence to him, let him handle it." Wade shifted in his saddle. "I'll testify if it comes to that. About what I saw in 1869, about what Clayton Drummond did to that Chinese girl and her man. I was young then, too scared to speak up. I've lived with that for 18 years. Time to make it right." Eli and Owen exchanged glances. This changed things. If Wade was willing to testify, if they could get to Cheyenne safely, they could bypass Drummond entirely. Bring federal authority to bear on a local crime. "Why are you helping us?" Owen asked. Wade was quiet for a moment. "Because I'm tired of being afraid. Because I saw what happened to Silas Boone, a good man destroyed by lies. Because my daughter asked me once why I became a lawman, and I told her it was to protect people. But I haven't protected anyone. I've just looked the other way while powerful men did what they wanted." He met their eyes. "Maybe it's too late to redeem myself, but I can at least tell the truth." "Thank you," Eli said simply. Wade nodded, turned his horse. "Take the northern trail out of here. Loops around Bitter Creek, adds maybe 2 days to your journey, but keeps you clear of Drummond. I'll meet you in Cheyenne in a week. Federal courthouse. And I'll bring the other evidence, the old service revolver Clayton used in 1869. He gave it to James when he died. I've seen it. Still has his initials carved in the grip. If there's any way to match bullets to the gun," he shrugged. "It's something." After Wade rode off, Eli and Owen sat their horses in silence, processing this new development. "We're going to make it," Owen said finally. "We're going to expose this whole thing, and we're going to win." Eli wasn't quite as confident. He'd seen too much of life to trust in certain victory, but he nodded anyway, turning Calico toward the northern trail. They had evidence, they had witnesses, and they had a federal marshal who might actually listen. It wasn't much, but it was more than Silas and Rebecca had ever had. It would have to be enough. The northern trail was rough and slow, adding precious time to their journey. But it kept them clear of Bitter Creek, and more importantly, clear of Drummond's immediate reach. They rode hard, stopping only when the horses needed rest, eating in the saddle, pushing through exhaustion. On the fourth day out from Promise Valley, they were within sight of Cheyenne when they heard horses behind them. Not one rider, but several. Coming fast, Eli pulled Calico to a stop, turned in the saddle. 3 riders emerged from the tree line about a quarter-mile back, moving at a gallop. Even at this distance, Eli recognized the lead rider's posture, the way he sat his horse, James Drummond. "He found us," Owen said, his voice tight with fear. "Wade must have been followed. Or maybe Drummond just guessed which way we'd go." Eli scanned the terrain quickly. They were in open country here, rolling hills with scattered trees. No good place to make a stand, and Cheyenne was still 3 miles ahead. "We run, stay low, keep moving. If we can make it to town—" They spurred their horses forward, and Calico and Owens Bay responded gamely, despite days of hard travel. Behind them, Drummond's group closed the distance steadily. Their horses were fresher, and they had the advantage of pursuit. They could focus entirely on catching up, while Eli and Owen had to navigate the terrain ahead. Gunfire cracked across the open space. A warning shot, or maybe Drummond was genuinely trying to hit them. Eli couldn't tell. He leaned low over Calico's neck, urging the paint to give everything he had. The old horse responded with heart, stretching into a full gallop despite his fatigue. They crested a rise, and Eli saw their salvation ahead, a small settlement on the outskirts of Cheyenne. Maybe 20 buildings clustered around a crossroads. People, witnesses, safety. If they could reach it before Drummond caught them, more gunfire. This time Eli heard the bullet whine past his ear. Not a warning shot. Drummond was done with warnings. They thundered down the slope toward the settlement. People came out of buildings, drawn by the sound of gunfire and galloping horses. Eli could see their faces, startled, curious, beginning to understand that something serious was happening. "Federal Marshal!" Eli shouted as they reached the first buildings. "We need the Federal Marshal!" A man stepped forward from the small courthouse building, hand on his gun. He was older, maybe 50, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen plenty of trouble. A badge glinted on his vest, not a sheriff's star, but a federal marshal's shield. "I'm Marshal Foster," he said calmly, taking in the scene. "What's going on here?" Drummond and his 2 deputies pulled up hard, their horses blowing from the chase. The sheriff's face was flushed with anger and exertion, but he quickly composed himself, putting on his official demeanor. "Marshal Foster," Drummond said, nodding respectfully. "I'm Sheriff James Drummond from Bitter Creek. These 2 men are fugitives. They've trespassed on private property, stolen evidence from a crime scene, and assaulted a peace officer. I'm here to take them into custody." "That's a lie," Owen said hotly. "He's lying to cover up his father's crimes." Foster held up a hand, silencing them both. His gaze moved between Drummond and Eli, assessing. "You're a long way from Bitter Creek, Sheriff. And you were shooting at these men just now. That doesn't look like standard arrest procedure. They were fleeing. I had to stop them before they reached federal jurisdiction." Drummond dismounted, his hand resting casually on his gun. "With all respect, Marshal, this is a local matter. I appreciate your concern, but I'll be taking these prisoners back to Bitter Creek to stand trial." "Local matters don't involve federal marshals," Foster said. His voice was mild, but there was steel underneath. "If you've got charges to file, you can file them through proper channels. But you're not taking anybody anywhere until I understand what's actually happening here." Eli pulled the oilcloth bundle from inside his coat, held it up. "Marshal Foster, my name is Eli Boone. This is Deputy Owen Keller from Bitter Creek. We've been investigating a crime that took place 18 years ago, attempted murder, land theft, and a cover-up that's lasted nearly 2 decades. We have evidence. Written testimony from the victim herself, court documents showing fraud, and witnesses willing to testify. Sheriff Drummond's father committed these crimes, and Sheriff Drummond has been using his authority to prevent the truth from coming out." Drummond's face went dark red. "That's slander. My father was a respected—" "Your father was a murderer and a thief," Eli interrupted, his voice hard. "He shot an unarmed woman and left her for dead. He stole land that belonged to my uncle, and he used his badge to make sure no one ever investigated." Eli stepped toward Foster, holding out the bundle. This is Rebecca Chen's journal. She wrote it in 1869, after your father shot her and left her bleeding in the forest. She survived, Marshal, and she wrote down everything that happened. Foster took the bundle, but his eyes stayed on Drummond. That true, Sheriff? Your father involved in a shooting back in 69? If something happened, and I'm not saying it did, it was legal enforcement of territorial law, Drummond said quickly. The Chinese weren't citizens. They had no rights to property, or they had the right not to be shot, Foster said flatly. He opened the bundle, saw the journal, the documents, the tin-type photograph. His expression shifted as he began to understand the scope of what he was looking at. This is substantial evidence. I'll need to review it all, take statements, conduct a proper investigation. There's nothing to investigate, Drummond insisted. My father did his duty. Your father shot a young woman and covered it up, Owen said, finding his courage. I'm a deputy, Marshal. I've served under Sheriff Drummond for 2 years. I took an oath to uphold the law. When I learned what his father had done, what he's been covering up, I knew I had to help bring the truth to light. The law doesn't protect murderers just because they wore a badge. Drummond's hand moved toward his gun, and everything happened fast. Foster's hand was faster, his weapon clearing leather and leveling at Drummond before the sheriff's gun was halfway drawn. Don't, the marshal said quietly. Don't make this worse than it already is. Behind Drummond, his 2 deputies had their hands in the air, clearly wanting no part of whatever their sheriff was planning. They were lawmen, not gunfighters, and they recognized federal authority when they saw it. Drummond froze, his hand still on his gun grip, his face a mask of rage and desperation. For a long moment, everyone stood perfectly still. Then slowly, Drummond released his weapon, raised his hands. Smart choice, Foster said. He gestured to one of the townspeople watching. You go find Deputy Marshal Crawford. Tell him we need backup here. To Drummond, you're going to surrender your weapons slowly, and then you're going to answer some questions. If you're innocent like you claim, you've got nothing to worry about. As Drummond unbuckled his gun belt with shaking hands, Eli felt something release in his chest. The weight he'd been carrying since finding that satchel behind the cabin, the weight of knowing what had happened to Silas and Rebecca, it wasn't gone, but it was shared now. Marshal Foster was taking it on, would see that justice was done. They'd made it. Against all odds, against Drummond's threats and violence, against 18 years of buried truth, they'd made it to someone who would listen, who would act, who would make sure the story was told. Eli looked at the tin-type photograph in Foster's hand, at those 2 young faces full of hope. Finally, after all these years, someone was fighting for them. Marshal Foster's office was a spare room in the federal courthouse, furnished with a desk, several chairs, and shelves lined with law books and territorial records. Eli and Owen sat on one side, while Foster reviewed the evidence they'd brought, his expression growing graver with each page he read. Rebecca's journal lay open before him. He'd been reading for nearly an hour, occasionally making notes, his weathered face showing the weight of what he was learning. Drummond sat in a chair near the door, hands cuffed, 2 deputy marshals standing guard. The sheriff's earlier bluster had faded into sullen silence. Finally, Foster looked up. This is damning. If this journal is authentic, and I have no reason to think it's not, then Clayton Drummond committed attempted murder, land theft, and abuse of authority. The fact that the victim survived doesn't change the severity of the crimes. My father acted within the law, Drummond said, but his voice lacked conviction now. The Chinese had no legal standing. The Chinese had the right not to be shot and left for dead, Foster interrupted. We've established that. What I'm trying to determine now is the extent of your involvement in covering this up. He looked at Eli. You said there were witnesses who would testify? Doc Holloway and Bitter Creek. He treated Silas after the attack, heard his account. He's willing to come forward now. Eli pulled out the court documents. And there's Deputy Wade. He was there in 1869, saw what happened. He's prepared to testify that Clayton Drummond shot Rebecca Chen. Foster made another note. I'll need to take their statements. Owen, you're prepared to testify about Sheriff Drummond's attempts to obstruct this investigation. Yes, sir, Owen said firmly. He threatened Mr. Boone, tried to prevent him from investigating. When he learned I was helping, he sent men after us. That's not law enforcement. That's conspiracy. Drummond surged to his feet, his face flushed. You're a traitor. You took an oath to serve under me. I took an oath to uphold the law. Owen shot back. Not to protect murderers. Not to help you cover up your father's crimes. Sit down, Sheriff, Foster said quietly. When Drummond didn't move, the marshal's voice hardened. Sit down or I'll have you put in a cell. Drummond sat, but the rage in his eyes was palpable. Eli watched him carefully, recognizing the look of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. That made him dangerous. Foster closed the journal carefully. Here's what's going to happen. I'm opening a federal investigation into the events of August 1869 and into Sheriff Drummond's conduct during Mr. Boone's investigation. Drummond, you're suspended from duty pending the outcome. You'll surrender your badge and remain in Cheyenne under house arrest while I gather evidence and testimony. You can't do this, Drummond protested. I'm an elected official. I'm a federal marshal investigating crimes that cross jurisdictions and involve the abuse of territorial authority, Foster said flatly. Yes, I can do this. And I am doing this, he turned to Eli. Mr. Boone, I'll need you and Deputy Keller to remain available for questioning. There's a boarding house 2 streets over where you can stay. As the deputy marshals led Drummond toward a holding cell, the sheriff stopped at the door, turned back to face Eli. You've destroyed everything, he said, his voice shaking. My family's name, my position, my life. For what? For a crazy hermit and a Chinese whore who ran away decades ago. Eli stood slowly, moved to stand directly in front of Drummond. He was close enough to see the sweat on the sheriff's forehead, the fear beneath the anger. For the truth, Eli said quietly. For 2 people who loved each other and deserved better than what your father gave them. For my uncle, who spent 18 years thinking he'd failed the woman he loved. For Rebecca Chen, who survived and rebuilt her life but never got justice. He held up the jade pendant, let it catch the light. This belonged to her. It's worth more than everything your family ever stole, because it was given in love, and love is something your father never understood. Drummond stared at the pendant, and for just a moment something like doubt crossed his face. Then it hardened again into stubborn denial. My father was a great man. Your father was a murderer, Eli said. And you know it. You've always known it. That's why you tried so hard to keep the truth buried. The deputy marshals pulled Drummond away, his protests echoing down the hallway. Foster waited until the sounds faded, then turned to Eli and Owen. You 2 did good work. Dangerous work, but good. He gestured to the evidence spread across his desk. This is going to cause quite a stir. The Drummond family has been influential in Wyoming territory for years. Exposing Clayton Drummond as a criminal will shake things up. Good, Eli said. Some things need shaking up. Foster allowed himself a small smile. Can't argue with that. His expression grew more serious. There's one more thing we need to discuss. Rebecca Chen. According to her journal, she was heading to California to find her mother's family. Do you want to try to locate her? Eli had been thinking about this for days now. Yes, she deserves to know that someone finally told her story, that Silas is at rest, that the truth came out. And her family deserves to know what really happened to her. I have contacts with the Chinese benevolent associations in San Francisco, Foster said. I can put out inquiries. It might take time. We're talking about events nearly 20 years old. But if she's alive, if her family's still there, we'll find them. That evening, Eli and Owen sat in the boarding house parlor, exhausted but unable to sleep. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd exposed the truth, brought federal authority to bear on a decades-old crime. But the victory felt incomplete somehow. What will you do now? Owen asked. Eli turned the jade pendant in his fingers, watching firelight play across the dark stone. Wait for Marshal Foster to find Rebecca or her family. Make sure they get this back. Make sure they know the whole story. He looked at Owen. What about you? I'm done being a deputy in Bitter Creek. Maybe I'll look for work as a marshal if Foster will have me. Or maybe I'll try something else. Owen smiled slightly. For the first time in years, I feel like I stood for something that mattered. Like I was part of something bigger than myself. I'd like to find that again. Eli understood that feeling. For 58 years he'd drifted, never committing to anything or anyone. Now, holding Rebecca's pendant, knowing he'd helped bring justice for Silas and Rebecca, he felt purpose settling into his bones. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. A reason to keep going. 3 days later, Deputy Wade arrived in Cheyenne as promised. He brought Clayton Drummond's old service revolver, the weapon that had shot Rebecca Chen and countless others over the years. He also brought his testimony, written out in careful detail, describing what he'd witnessed in August 1869, with Wade's statement added to the other evidence. The case against Clayton Drummond's legacy was complete. Marshal Foster filed formal charges posthumously, a symbolic gesture perhaps, since the man was beyond earthly justice. But it mattered. It meant Rebecca Chen was officially recognized as a victim of attempted murder. It meant Silas Boone's land claim was acknowledged as legitimate, stolen through fraud and violence. It meant the truth was on record. James Drummond was charged with obstruction of justice, threatening witnesses, and abuse of authority. He would face trial, would likely lose his position and possibly his freedom. The Drummond name, once powerful in Wyoming territory, was finished. 2 weeks after arriving in Cheyenne, Eli received word from Marshal Foster. The Chinese Benevolent Association in San Francisco had located Rebecca Chen, or rather, Rebecca Chen Wong. She'd married in 1872, had 3 children, and ran a successful import business with her husband. She was alive, healthy, and willing to speak with Eli. When he read that message, Eli felt tears on his face for the first time in decades. She'd made it. She'd survived, thrived, built a beautiful life from the ashes of her dreams. Silas would have been so proud of her. He booked passage on the next train to California. San Francisco in early spring was nothing like Wyoming territory. The air was soft and salt-tinged, the hills covered in green rather than snow, and the streets thronged with people of every nationality imaginable. Eli walked through Chinatown with directions written on paper, following them to a modest storefront on Grant Avenue. The sign above the door read, Chen and Wong Import Company, in both English and Chinese characters. Through the window, Eli could see shelves lined with tea, silk, porcelain, and jade. A bell chimed as he entered. The woman behind the counter looked up, and Eli's breath caught. She was older now, her hair streaked with grey, lines around her eyes and mouth. But he recognized her from the tintype, the same delicate features, the same intelligent gaze. Rebecca Chen Wong, at 42, and carried herself with the dignity and strength of someone who'd survived what should have killed her and built something beautiful from the survival. Mrs. Wong, Eli said, removing his hat. My name is Eli Boone. I wrote to you, you're Silas's nephew. Her voice was soft but clear, with only the faintest trace of an accent. I received your letter. I've been expecting you. She led him to a small office behind the store, poured tea into delicate porcelain cups, and sat across from him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, 2 people connected by tragedy and survival, by a man they'd both loved in different ways. Tell me about Silas, she said finally. How did he live? How did he die? Eli told her everything, about finding the cabin, about Silas dying alone but not forgotten, about the satchel buried in the snow with her letter and the map and the pendant. He told her about Doc Holloway's testimony, about how Silas had never stopped loving her, had never believed she'd simply run away. He thought I was dead, Rebecca said quietly. Tears gathered in her eyes but didn't fall. All those years, he carried that guilt, that grief. I've thought about him so often, wondered if he was happy, if he'd found peace. But I never imagined, her voice broke slightly, I never imagined he spent 18 years mourning me. Your journal saved us, Eli said. He pulled it from his satchel, placed it on the table between them. You left it in the cave, hoping he might find it. He never did. But I found it, and it told me everything I needed to know. It brought justice, Rebecca. For you, for Silas, for everyone Clayton Drummond hurt. She touched the journal with trembling fingers, but didn't open it. I was so angry when I wrote this, angry and hurt and terrified. But I was also determined to survive, to live, to prove that they couldn't break me. She looked up at Eli. Did I do the right thing, leaving him to think I was dead? Or should I have found a way to tell him I survived? You did what you had to do to stay alive, Eli said gently. Drummond would have killed you both if he'd known you survived. You chose life. That took courage. It took fear, she corrected. I was afraid. Every day for years, I was afraid he'd find me, finish what he started. It wasn't until my children were born that I finally felt safe enough to stop looking over my shoulder. She smiled slightly, sadly. Silas would have loved my children. They're strong, educated, proud of who they are. I named my oldest son Silas. My husband understood. He knew the story, knew I'd loved someone before him. He never resented it. Eli pulled out the jade pendant, held it out to her. This belongs to you. Your grandmother's pendant. Silas kept it safe all these years. Rebecca took the pendant with shaking hands, held it to her chest, and finally let the tears fall. I gave this to him the day we had our photograph taken. Told him it was a promise, that I'd wait for him, that we'd build our life together no matter what obstacles we faced. She fastened it around her neck, the dark jade settling at her throat. I've carried so much guilt, Eli. Guilt for surviving when Silas suffered. Guilt for marrying another man, for building a happy life while he was alone. But holding this again, knowing he kept it, it feels like forgiveness. Like he's telling me I did the right thing by living. They sat together for a long time, drinking tea, sharing memories of a man they'd both loved. Rebecca told stories of their summer together, of his kindness and humor, of how he'd made her feel like the most important person in the world. Eli told her about finding the pressed flowers in the Bible, about the margin notes, about how even in his brokenness, Silas had remained thoughtful and gentle. I want to visit his grave, Rebecca said finally. And I want to see Promise Valley. The place we dreamed of building our life. Would you take me there? 2 months later, in early May, when the snow had melted and wildflowers covered the mountain meadows, Eli returned to Wyoming territory. He didn't come alone. With him were Rebecca, her husband Chen Wei, and their 3 children, Silas, age 16, Lily, age 14, and James, age 12. They rode to Promise Valley together, following the same map that had guided Eli months before. When they crested the final ridge and the valley opened before them, Rebecca gasped. Even after 18 years, even after all that had happened, this place still held beauty and promise. The old foundation was still there, now surrounded by spring flowers. Rebecca walked to it slowly, knelt, ran her hands over the weathered logs. "We were going to build our cabin right here," she said softly. "We measured it out together, planned every detail. Then let's finish what you started," Eli said. Over the next week, with help from Owen Keller and several townspeople from Bitter Creek who'd learned the truth and wanted to make amends, they built a cabin on that foundation. Not a large structure, but solid and beautiful, the home Silas and Rebecca should have had. They planted fruit trees near the door, just as the young couple had planned, and near the creek, under the shade of an old pine. They placed 2 headstones. The first read, Silas Boone, 1837-1887, beloved, his love endured all things. The second, placed beside it, for Rebecca Chen, 1845. Though separated by injustice, united by love. A life well lived in defiance of hatred. Rebecca stood before the stones, her children around her, her husband's hand in hers. "He never got to know this," she said, gesturing to her family, to the proof of her survival and happiness. "But I think he would have wanted this. Would have wanted me to live fully, to find joy again. He would have," Eli said with certainty. The journal made that clear. "You honored his memory by living, Rebecca, by refusing to let what happened destroy you. That took more courage than most of us ever show." Later, as sunset painted Promise Valley in shades of gold and rose, Eli stood with Calico near the new cabin. The paint horse grazed peacefully, the mountains rising purple in the distance. Rebecca's children ran through the meadow, their laughter carrying on the wind. Her husband tended a fire preparing dinner. Rebecca herself sat on the cabin's new porch, the jade pendant at her throat catching the fading light. Eli pulled out Silas's pocket watch, the one he'd carried since finding it at the cabin. He'd had it repaired in San Francisco, and now it ticked steadily, keeping time as it should. He wound it carefully, set it to match the angle of the sun. Time didn't stop. Life continued. People survived terrible things and built beautiful lives from the wreckage. Love endured even when separated by death and distance and the cruelty of unjust laws. Sometimes a man reached an age where he had more regrets than road ahead. But sometimes, if he was lucky, if he was brave enough, he got a chance to make something right. To honor the past while embracing the future. To find purpose in the twilight of his years. Eli had found that chance in a frozen satchel, in a woman's letter, in the truth buried beneath 18 years of lies. He'd found it, and he'd seized it. And now he stood in Promise Valley watching the sun set over the home that should have been, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades, peace. The past had been acknowledged. The truth had been told. Justice, imperfect but real, had been served. And Rebecca Chen Wong, survivor and victor, stood as living proof that hatred didn't win, that love endured, that some stories, no matter how long they took to tell, ended with hope rather than despair. Eli spoke quietly to the evening wind, to the ghosts of the past, to Silas and all the other good people broken by injustice. Your story has been told. You can rest now. The truth has set you free. The stars emerged, brilliant and infinite, as night settled over Promise Valley. Tomorrow, Eli would return to the cabin he'd inherited, the home that was no longer a place of sadness, but a connection to something larger than himself. He'd tend it, preserve it, make sure it remained as a testament to Silas Boone, a man who'd loved deeply, suffered terribly, and deserved to be remembered not for his brokenness, but for his heart. And perhaps, in his remaining years, Eli would finally learn what Silas and Rebecca had always known, that a life measured not by what you accumulated or how far you traveled, but by who you loved and how fiercely you fought for truth, was a life worth living. In the cabin behind him, Rebecca laughed at something her husband said. Her children's voices rose in song. The smell of cooking food drifted on the breeze. Life continuing, love persisting, hope renewed. Sometimes Eli thought justice comes late. But late is better than never. And sometimes, in the end, the good people win. Not always. But sometimes.